Twilight has faced scrutiny from critics and even some fans, but like any popular series, it delivers on the essentials. It has a star-crossed and forbidden romance, colorful world building, a memorable setting, and of course a slew of creepy villains. Meyer's saga features multiple baddies, from the sadistic James to the misguided and deadly Victoria, but no villain is more memorable or sinister than Arrow. No paranormal adventure is complete without a big bad, and Arrow, as far as antagonists go, delivers. Eccentric and enthused on the surface, and manipulative and power-hungry behind closed doors, Arrow is a fascinating character, not only on the pages or the screen, but throughout his origin story. He might seem cold-hearted, but he's both more caring and more cruel than any reader would have believed. Arrow does feel for others, he can form friendships, and he can experience guilt, but he's all the more wicked for his willingness to place power before his conscience. Before we continue, I'm Riley and this is Otherworldly Fiction. On this channel, I rant about books, discuss characters, share bookish lore, and offer writing advice. If any of this sounds like your cup of blood, hit that subscribe button. Posts are on Fridays. Arrow's backstory holds a dark secret, one which will only convince those unfamiliar with his tale that he's every bit the monster others have suspected him of being. As it turns out, the unease Bella feels when she thinks of the black-cloaked coven isn't unfounded. Arrow is extremely old, having been a human during the times of ancient Greece, in the year 1340 BC. This means he is thousands of years old. And in that time, he's gone a little crazy. He's never lost his faculties by any means, but over the centuries he's grown eccentric. As a young man, halfway through his 20s, Arrow was changed. However, even with his superior mind-reading talent, he wasn't content to live alone. Ambition drove him to find other like-minded individuals, which led him first to Marcus, and then to Caius and his wife Athenodora. Together, the four of them founded the Volturi, and the three of them, Arrow, Marcus, and Caius, became its leaders. Becoming a vampire and beginning a coven didn't prevent Arrow from maintaining an interest in his human family. Arrow's gift was exceptional, allowing him to read the entirety of a person's mind, provided he touched them. In this way, he could access every former emotion, every past thought or opinion, every plan, and every memory. Spurred on by the success of his gift, he looked for similar powers amongst his own family. Having been a vampire for roughly 10 years, Arrow made the choice to offer immortality to his younger human sister, Didyme. During the same period, Arrow selected a woman from the human pool to be his wife. Sepulsia grew to love him, and vice versa. But even in choosing her, there was a practical purpose. For all their adoration, Sepulsia was still chosen because she fit into Arrow's schemes, something he believed a vampire woman already changed wouldn't be able to do. Didyme, likewise, was chosen, not just because her brother cared about her, but because she could further his cause. As it turned out, Arrow's hunch was correct. Didyme did have a gift, but it wasn't the kind to control armies or win wars. Beautiful but simple, the talent Didyme possessed was that of making those around her happy. It could have its uses, but it was hardly an indispensable power, and it backfired for her brother. Everyone adored Didyme. Her ability to fill others with cheer drew them to her, and Arrow's co-conspirator, Marcus, was no exception. Many fell for Didyme, but when Marcus grew attached to Arrow's sister, she grew to love him back. Becoming mates, the ambitions of the Volturi had lost their luster for Marcus and Didyme. The lovers desired to travel, to see the world and spend time together. Arrow was at a loss. Marcus was integral to his plan, not only because he was one of the original three, but because he also had a gift. Though it wasn't a flashy talent, it was extremely useful in battle. Marcus could read the emotional bonds of those they encountered, which enabled Arrow to strategize accordingly. If someone was too attached to their mate, destroying said mate could encourage them to join the Volturi, simply because they'd have no other purpose. Arrow consented to the plans of Marcus and Didyme, but this was only a ruse. Didyme trusted her brother, and the love he'd felt for her wasn't a facade. The care between them was genuine, but even love couldn't overcome Arrow's ambition. When no one was watching, Arrow killed his own sister. Once again, though, Arrow's actions had consequences. With Didyme's death, Marcus had no reason to leave the Volturi. His gift would remain at Arrow's disposal, but his spark was gone. Lifeless and indifferent, he could only be made to participate through Chelsea's manipulation. Arrow had since collected other guards and vampires with gifts, and Chelsea was among the best of his finds. Chelsea could alter the bonds people had between each other, breaking ties, strengthening them, or changing them to fit Arrow's needs. If a coven's loyalty needed to be destroyed in battle, Chelsea could do so. If Arrow wanted to inspire friendship or loyalty, Chelsea was there. Arrow's subordinates were no exception, and Chelsea's gift was such that the various members of the Volturi practically worshipped Arrow, referring to him as Master. Even Arrow's fellow leaders, Marcus and Caius, didn't escape these subtle manipulations. Caius's ideas were different from Arrow's, but because of Chelsea, he fell into step with Arrow. Though he'd scoff on occasion and argue with Arrow, he'd never threaten his leadership. As for Marcus, the tether Chelsea wound between him and the Volturi was all that kept him from sinking into despair. He remained involved, but ultimately uncaring, and Arrow, for his part, learned to carry his guilt through the centuries. However much a monster Arrow was, he wasn't sadistic like Caius. While Caius enjoyed punishment, Arrow tried to avoid violence where possible. He had friends, and he felt love, and his affection for his sister would leave him with regret for what he'd done. Of course, his guilt wasn't enough for him to tell the truth. As the centuries passed, Marcus remained ignorant of the true identity of his sister's killer. Not one to linger over his mistakes, Arrow pressed forward. If Didyme's death had taught him anything, it was that they'd be as vulnerable as Marcus if someone attacked their mates. Therefore, Arrow and Caius made a point of protecting their wives. Never leaving the tower, Sulpicia and Athenadora remained behind closed doors. Surrounded by guards, they were untouchable. Even when they did venture out, they were kept in the center of the Volturi force. Arrow wasn't the only ambitious vampire, as the Romanian coven had likewise established a great force. Prey was delivered to them, and others sought them out, but Arrow only saw them as a threat. Craving their power, the Volturi wiped out the mighty Romanian vampires. Though Vladimir and Stefan escaped, their empire was gone. Arrow, together with Marcus and Caius, took their place as the ultimate power, and in 500 AD, the Volturi were law itself among vampires. Arrow was always the true leader, hatching schemes and having the final say on all matters. As a result, he represented the others, and during negotiations, he was the one people spoke with. Though corrupt, the Volturi did benefit vampires overall. For one, Arrow understood the importance of secrecy. His laws were harsh, but they existed to prevent humans from discovering the truth about vampires. In more superstitious ages, humans did believe in vampires, yet their ideas were wrong, their beliefs, such as those involving crosses or a lack of reflection in glass, being incorrect. Hoping to protect a vampire from discovery, should he be questioned, the Volturi encouraged these myths. If a vampire was accused, he'd be able to pass any test a human placed before him. He'd resist a cross, cast a reflection, and so on, assuring his survival. In this way, scrutiny was removed from real vampires when they didn't live up to the legends the masses clung to. Furthermore, Arrow outlawed any practices which could draw undue attention to a coven. After studying the immortal children, those vampires created from human kids, with some as young as toddlers, Arrow decided to ban anyone from creating any more. Those who existed were destroyed, along with their creators, and there was no mercy for anyone who flouted this rule. Immortal children couldn't be taught. Mentally stuck at the ages they were turned at, their tantrums and impulses could undo whole villages. They didn't know how to, or care to, hide themselves, and their actions led humans to notice something was amiss. There was no official cutoff age, but it was generally understood that anyone younger than a teenager shouldn't be changed. Arrow's adherence to his own law was challenged when he encountered two toddlers, twins, who exhibited remarkable gifts. Though intrigued, Arrow resisted the urge to change them. He decided he'd return later, changing them when they were almost adults. Unfortunately, he didn't have the luxury of waiting as long as he'd have liked. The twins, Jane and Alec, were to be burned at the stake. Accused of witchcraft, their abilities had earned them the ire of the locals. Arrow intervened, but he was nearly too late. The children had already been put to the flame, and it was now or never if they were to be turned. Therefore, at only 12 years of age, Jane and Alec were transformed. Arrow revenged himself on the village, and brought the children, who would be among his most prized followers, back to Volterra. Though not toddlers, Jane and Alec were still technically children, demonstrating Arrow's willingness to bend, if not outright break, his law for the sake of his greed. Thankfully for Arrow, the twins were mature enough that he could control them and prevent any mishaps, and he remained fond of them through the centuries, especially since they gave his coven virtual invincibility. No one could withstand the twins' powers. Jane could cripple her enemies with psychic pain, and Alec could cut off the senses of his prey. In this way, they incapacitated all they met, turning Arrow's targets into sitting ducks. In time, Arrow befriended Carlisle Cullen. They enjoyed spending time together, and Carlisle lingered with the Volturi for a time. They didn't agree on everything, but their friendship overcame this. Each respected the beliefs of the other, even if they debate their side, and Carlisle came away from his experience with mostly positive feelings towards the Volturi. On hearing that Carlisle subsisted on animals, Arrow was initially frightened. He was concerned his friend would sicken over time, but he was pleased when it became clear this wasn't the case. He'd still push Carlisle to try human blood, but when Carlisle declined, he remained happy for his friend. As the years passed, Arrow received another visitor, none other than Laurent, who would later join Victoria and James. Laurent wasn't dismissed immediately, but he was drawn to power. He sought to advance his own cause by following the big kids on the playground. Unfortunately for Laurent, Arrow's coven wasn't the first he sought out. Having had a brief stint with the Romanians, reports of Laurent's movements reached Arrow. Still wary of his old enemies, Arrow declined Laurent's request to join them. Eventually, Arrow came to take an interest in the Cullen clan. Though Carlisle remained his friend, he was willing to risk his friendship for the sake of acquisition. There was nothing Arrow wouldn't do to gain what he wanted, but even Chelsea, the Volturi's most valued member, couldn't sever the ties of the family. A diet of animal blood had actually benefited the family, and that they could form deeper bonds with one another. Though Chelsea struggled to erode the bond between mated pairs, which are always intense among vampires, even the platonic bonds between the Cullens proved difficult. They truly regarded one another as family, their parent-child or sibling relationships remaining as powerful and meaningful as those of romantic affection. Their loyalty to one another, their power together, and the lasting affection Arrow had for Carlisle prevented him from attacking the family. Yet he came to envy them their abilities, and to feel threatened. The Cullens had the potential to challenge him, especially if they grew bigger. No other coven, outside the Volturi, was as large and gifted as the Cullens. The member Arrow desired the most was, of course, Alice. Alice was yet another reason why Arrow couldn't launch an attack, because she could see when he was going to come. Always watched by the family, and seeing the potential in Alice's gift if he controlled it, Arrow bided his time. There had never been a vampire he wanted as badly as Alice. It was only with the arrival of Bella that Alice gained competition. Though only human when Arrow met her, she exhibited a talent powerful enough even to rebuff him. Not one to overlook possibilities, Arrow saw her potential. While Caius was eager to enact punishment against what he saw as a nosy human, Arrow was anxious for Bella to be changed. He was thrilled by what her gift could evolve into. If she was able to resist both him and Jane while human, what would she be capable of as a vampire? Alice proved Arrow's wish would come true. Allowing Arrow to read her mind, the Volturi leader saw a vision of Bella as a vampire. Alice would assure her she was changed, thereby enabling Bella to leave unharmed. Being given the opportunity to experience Alice's powers also delighted Arrow, reinforcing his anxiety to possess her. As with his previous predictions, Arrow was correct. Bella proved to be as useful as Alice, expanding her shield so that it could protect others. With the Cullens gaining such a gift, they became even more of a threat to the Volturi. Jane and Alec were Arrow's trump cards, and Bella could render them useless. With his own advantages removed, Arrow realized he'd be forced to fight fairly, with all the risks that entailed. Arrow brought the whole of the Volturi to destroy the Cullens, on a report from Irina that they'd created an immortal child. But her findings were inaccurate, and Arrow himself was set straight. Renesmee was indeed half-human, as evidenced by a scan of Edward's mind, and several of the witnesses were willing to protect the child. What's more, Jane and Alec were powerless. Bella's shield repelled Alec's vapor, and Jane's pain-inducing glares. Seeing that the tables had turned, and that the Volturi could sustain serious casualties, Arrow was relieved when Alice appeared, bringing with her another half-immortal, Nahuel, to plead the Cullens' case. With sufficient evidence Renesmee would not endanger the secrecy of their kind, Arrow eagerly left, though he now harbored as much hope of possessing Bella as he did Alice. Humbled by his defeat, and still greedy for the gifts which littered the Cullen clan, Arrow could pose a threat down the line, at least according to Edward, who predicted the Volturi would seek revenge. As a side note, Arrow was actually punished for his actions in the Twilight rewrite, Twilight Reimagined Life and Death, in which it is noted that he was killed shortly after murdering his sister. His wife, Sepulchia, knew the truth and handed him over to Marcus. They were hesitant to destroy Arrow because of his unique talent, but when another vampire, Meal, arrived, they had a solution. Meal's ability was to transfer the talent of one vampire to another. In this way, Arrow's gift would be preserved. His mind-reading abilities were given to Sepulchia, and he in turn was executed for the murder of his sister. In conclusion, while there's been no official word of a sequel series, Twilight's ending would seem to indicate there could be more. With the series' big bad still on the move, the Cullens can never be completely safe. The Volturi are a giant loose thread, and in the original series, Marcus remains in the dark when it comes to his true love's death. It's safe to say then that if there are any sequels, the Volturi will play a role. Whatever the flaws of the series, and there are several, Meyer earns credit for developing some creepy villains. Arrow in particular is a memorable enough baddie, with an occasional redeeming moment, clear motives, and a varied personality. Calculating and crazy, excited but cunning, and loving but greedy, Arrow isn't an antagonist to be underestimated. His story reveals someone who would do anything for power, even if it means sacrificing friendship and love. Though capable of feeling for others, nothing supersedes Arrow's ruthless side, and his ambitions predict a future conflict for fans of the series to sink their teeth into, while revealing a big bad who's actually pretty cool. What do you think will happen next? Do you think Marcus will learn the truth? Do you want to see Arrow faces match? Let me know in the comments, and if you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe. Thank you for watching, and happy reading!